9-year-old boy spends every night watching over his baby sister in her crib and refuses to leave. Intrigued, the mother decides to install a camera in the room and discovers something that makes her blood run cold. The digital clock on Sophie's dresser cast a soft blue glow across the darkened nursery, its numbers marking another hour. 2:17 a.m. Thomas sat cross-legged on the floor beside his sister's crib, his Batman pajamas wrinkled from hours of stillness. His back pressed against the wall, head tilted slightly to maintain his view of both the window and Sophie's peaceful sleeping form. The steady rhythm of her breathing had long ago become his lullaby, though he fought against its hypnotic pull. 9 years old and already carrying the weight of the world on his narrow shoulders. Dark circles had taken up permanent residence beneath his eyes, aging his boyish face. His teachers would notice them tomorrow, just as they had yesterday and the day before. They'd whisper their concerns to each other in the staff room, share worried glances when he dozed off during math class. But Thomas didn't care. They didn't understand. Nobody did. The sound of soft footsteps in the hallway made him tense. His mother doing another of her midnight checks. The door creaked open, and Emma Baker's exhausted face appeared in the gap. "Tommy," she whispered, using the nickname he'd recently declared himself too old for. "Sweetheart, please. You need to sleep in your own bed." Thomas shook his head, a gesture so slight it was barely perceptible in the darkness. "I'm okay here." Emma pushed the door wider, padding into the room in her oversized MIT sweatshirt and plaid pajama pants. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, stray strands falling around her face. She looked as tired as Thomas felt, the strain of single parenthood etched into the premature lines around her eyes. "This isn't healthy," she said, crouching beside him. Her hand found his shoulder warm and comforting. "You're exhausted. Mrs. Reynolds called today. She says you fell asleep during your presentation." "It wasn't important anyway," Thomas mumbled, though the memory of his classmates' snickers still stung. He'd worked hard on that presentation about the solar system, staying up late to paint his model of Jupiter's storms. But that was before everything changed. Emma sighed, the sound heavy with helplessness. "Tommy, Dad wouldn't want." "Don't." The word came out sharper than he intended, making Sophie stir in her crib. Both mother and son held their breath until she settled again, tiny fingers clutching her yellow blanket. Emma tried a different approach. "What if we moved your bed in here, just for a little while?" But Thomas knew better. Temporary solutions had a way of becoming permanent, like the casseroles that still appeared on their doorsteps 6 months after the funeral, like the sympathy cards that kept arriving, like the grief counselor's weekly visits that never seemed to end. "I need to stay here," he insisted, voice barely above a whisper. "I need to watch." "Watch for what, sweetheart?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. How could he explain what he didn't fully understand himself? The shadows that seemed deeper than they should be, the sounds that didn't belong to their old house's normal creaks and settle, the feeling that crept up his spine whenever he looked out Sophie's window at night. Instead of answering, Thomas reached up to adjust Sophie's blanket where it had slipped down. His sister sighed in her sleep, a contented sound that made his chest ache with fierce protectiveness. She was so small, so defenseless. She wouldn't remember their father's laugh, or how he used to sing horrible off-key renditions of Beatles songs while making pancakes on Sunday mornings. She wouldn't remember anything at all unless Thomas made sure she had the chance to grow up and make new memories. Emma watched this tender gesture, her heart breaking all over again. After a long moment, she leaned in and pressed a kiss to Thomas's forehead. "Just try to rest a little, okay? Even if you stay here, lean back against the wall and close your eyes. Please." Thomas nodded, not meeting her gaze. They both knew he wouldn't sleep. He hadn't really slept in weeks. "I love you," Emma whispered, standing with the stiff movements of someone much older than her 34 years. "Both of you." "Love you too, Mom." The door closed with a soft click, leaving Thomas alone with his vigil once more. Outside, a car drove past, its headlights sweeping across the ceiling in slow motion. Thomas tracked their movement, counting the seconds until darkness returned. In her crib, Sophie made a small sound, and he automatically reached through the bars to touch her hand, offering comfort even in sleep. The digital clock changed. 2:23 a.m. 7 minutes since he'd last checked. The night stretched ahead, long and dark and full of unknowns. But Thomas wouldn't move. He couldn't. Not when he was the only one who noticed the car that drove by their house too often, or the shadow that sometimes lingered too long beneath Sophie's window. Not when he was the only one who understood that the monsters weren't just in fairy tales anymore. He shifted slightly, trying to find a more comfortable position against the wall. His eyelids felt like they were made of lead, but he forced them to stay open. The night wasn't over yet, and Thomas had promises to keep, promises he'd made to himself, to Sophie, and to a father who would never come home again. The clock ticked on. 2:24 a.m. Just another night in the Baker household, where a 9-year-old boy waged a silent war against exhaustion, and the shadows seemed to watch and wait and grow. The autumn wind rattled the branches against Sophie's window, creating shadows that danced across the nursery walls. Thomas watched them with growing unease, trying to distinguish natural movement from something more sinister. It was just past midnight, and the street outside had fallen into its usual suburban silence, broken only by the occasional passing car. But this car wasn't passing. It had been parked across the street for the last hour, its dark outline barely visible through the gauzy curtains. Thomas had counted. This was the 4th night this week he'd seen it, always between midnight and 3 a.m., always in slightly different spots but always with a clear view of their house. Mrs. Reynolds' words from earlier that day echoed in his head. "Thomas, this is the 3rd time this week you've fallen asleep in class. If this continues, I'll have no choice but to schedule a parent-teacher conference." She'd handed him back his science test, the red D stark against the white paper. He'd used to love science, used to dream about being an astronaut or a marine biologist. Now, those dreams seemed as distant as the stars he could barely see through Sophie's window. A floorboard creaked in the hallway, and Thomas tensed. But it was just their elderly golden retriever, Cooper, making his nightly rounds. The dog padded into the nursery, his graying muzzle and gentle eyes appearing in the dim light. He made his way to Thomas, settling down beside him with a soft whimper. "Good boy," Thomas whispered, scratching behind Cooper's ears. "You feel it too, don't you? Something's not right." The dog's ears perked up suddenly, his head turning toward the window. Thomas followed his gaze, breath catching in his throat. There, a shadow moving across the front lawn, too deliberate to be cast by the swaying trees. Cooper let out a low growl, so quiet it was almost inaudible. Thomas reached for his mother's old iPhone, the one she'd given him for emergencies after Dad died, though it could only connect to Wi-Fi. His hands trembled as he opened the camera app, trying to capture evidence of what he was seeing. But by the time he raised the phone, the shadow had disappeared. The car across the street started its engine. Thomas scrambled to his feet, careful not to wake Sophie. He pressed his face against the window, using his hands to block out the room's reflection. The vehicle moved slowly down their street, a dark sedan, its make and model obscured by the night. No distinctive features except his heart nearly stopped. There was something wrong with the license plate. It was covered or altered somehow, making it impossible to read. That wasn't normal. That wasn't someone who just happened to park on their street. Cooper whined again, pressing against Thomas's leg. Outside, the sedan turned the corner and vanished. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that it would be back. They always came back. A soft cry from the crib pulled his attention away from the window. Sophie was stirring, her small face scrunching up in what might be the beginning of tears. Thomas moved quickly to her side, reaching through the bars to stroke her hair the way Mom did. "Shoo, it's okay," he whispered. "Your big brother's here. Nothing bad's going to happen to you. I promise." Sophie settled under his touch, her features relaxing back into peaceful sleep. Thomas envied her innocence, her ability to find comfort so easily. He couldn't remember the last time he'd slept without jerking awake at every sound, every shadow. The digital clock read 12:47 a.m. when Thomas heard his mother's laptop whirring to life in her home office down the hall. She'd been taking on extra freelance work lately, trying to make up well, for everything. The familiar sound of her typing provided a strange comfort, a reminder that he wasn't the only one awake in the house. He returned to his spot against the wall, Cooper lying faithful beside him. The dog's presence made him feel a little braver, a little less alone in his vigilance. Thomas pulled out his notebook, the one he'd started keeping 3 weeks ago when he first noticed the car. With trembling hands, he recorded the time, the description of the vehicle, and the shadow he'd seen. The entries were starting to fill pages. October 15th, dark sedan. Tinted windows, parked from 1:20 to 2:45 a.m. October 17th, same car, different spot. Midnight, 2:15 a.m. October 19th, footsteps in the garden below window. Cooper barked. Car left quickly. Today's entry would be the longest yet. Thomas wrote carefully, determined to document every detail. If something happened, if someone finally believed him, he wanted there to be proof that he hadn't imagined it all. A sudden gust of wind sent the trees into a frenzy of movement, their shadows writhing on the walls like living things. Cooper's head snapped up, ears forward, listening to something Thomas couldn't hear. The boy held his breath, pen frozen mid-word. There it was again, a sound that didn't belong. Not the wind, not the trees, not the house settling. It was the soft crunch of footsteps on fallen leaves, directly below Sophie's window. Thomas clutched his phone, thumb hovering over the emergency call button. Cooper's growl was louder now, rumbling deep in his chest. Sophie stirred again but didn't wake. The footsteps moved slowly across the lawn, accompanied by a new sound, the quiet click of what might have been a camera shutter. Thomas's hand shook as he tried to steady his phone, desperate to capture proof. But all he could see through the window was darkness, broken occasionally by the beam of a flashlight sweeping across their front yard. When morning came, he knew what would happen. Mom would check the yard and find nothing. The police would drive by and see nothing suspicious. His teachers would attribute his exhaustion to grief, his paranoia to trauma. But Thomas knew what he'd seen, what he'd heard. He pulled his knees to his chest, one hand still clutching the phone, while the other found comfort in Cooper's fur. The night stretched ahead, long and dark and full of whispered threats that only he seemed to hear. But he wouldn't sleep. He couldn't. Not when the shadows had started whispering back. "He seems nice," Emma said, watching through the kitchen window as their new neighbor methodically raked leaves in his front yard. "It'll be good to have someone actually living in that house again." Thomas didn't respond, pushing his cereal around in his bowl. He was fighting to keep his eyes open, the morning sun feeling too bright after another sleepless night. From her high chair, Sophie babbled happily, throwing Cheerios onto the floor where Cooper eagerly snapped them up. The man across the street, Robert Nash, he'd introduced himself as, looked up and waved. Emma waved back with a tired smile. Thomas watched as Nash's gaze shifted, moving from his mother to the window of Sophie's nursery above. Something cold settled in his stomach. "Did you see his car?" Thomas asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Emma was wiping Sophie's face, distracted by the morning routine. "Oh, the BMW? It's nice. He said he's in investment banking or something like that." "It's black," Thomas pressed. "Like the one that parks here at night." Emma's hands stilled. She turned to look at him, worry creasing her forehead. "Tommy, we've talked about this. The police checked the street 3 times this week. There's no suspicious car. Because it's not there when they come. It only comes at night when... That's enough." Emma's voice was firm but gentle. "I know you're worried about Sophie. I know." She paused, swallowing hard. "I know losing Dad has been hard on all of us. But seeing threats everywhere isn't healthy." The doorbell rang before Thomas could argue further. Cooper barked once, tail wagging as Emma went to answer it. Thomas knew who it would be before the door opened. He'd seen Nash walking up their driveway with something in his hands. "Good morning." Nash's voice carried into the kitchen, smooth and friendly. "I made way too much banana bread yesterday. Thought your kids might enjoy some. Thomas listened to his mother's thanks, to the easy conversation that followed. Nash's laugh was perfect. Not too loud. Not too soft. Everything about him was perfect, calculated, like an actor who'd studied his role thoroughly. Is this your son? Nash appeared in the kitchen doorway, and Thomas felt the weight of his gaze. The man was tall and well-dressed in expensive casual wear, his salt and pepper hair styled just so. He smiled, showing perfect white teeth. I'm Rob, your new neighbor. Thomas nodded but didn't speak. Under the table, Cooper pressed against his legs, unusually quiet. And this must be Sophie. Nash's attention shifted to the high chair, his smile widening. She's adorable. How old is she? 18 months, Emma answered, setting the banana bread on the counter. And already getting into everything, aren't you, sweetheart? Sophie squealed in response, reaching for the new visitor with sticky hands. Nash stepped closer to the high chair, and Thomas found himself standing up so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. I need to get ready for school, he announced abruptly. Emma gave him a look, but Nash just chuckled. Not a morning person? I remember those days. School's tough when you're tired. His eyes lingered on the dark circles under Thomas's eyes. Not sleeping well. The question felt like a threat, though Thomas couldn't explain why. He shrugged and left the kitchen, but not before hearing Nash's next words to his mother. You know, I used to work with troubled kids before I got into finance. If you ever want to talk. Thomas took the stairs 2 at a time, needing to check Sophie's room. Everything looked normal. The window was locked, the curtains drawn just as he'd left them. But something felt different. He crossed to the window, looking down at the spot where Nash now stood chatting with his mother by the front gate. As if sensing his gaze, Nash looked up, that perfect smile still in place. In the morning light, there was nothing obviously threatening about Robert Nash. He was handsome in a generic way, his clothes expensive but not flashy, his manner warm and engaging. The kind of neighbor anyone would want. But Thomas remembered the sound of footsteps in leaves that shouldn't have been disturbed. He thought about the dark car with its obscured license plate, about the camera clicks in the night. His hand found the notebook hidden under Sophie's changing table, filled with his careful documentation of things the adults refused to see. A new entry formed in his mind. October 22nd, Robert Nash moves in across the street. Black BMW in driveway. Same make as night car. Cooper appeared in the doorway, whining softly. The dog had been acting strange since Nash's arrival, staying close to Thomas and Sophie, growing alert at odd moments. Mom said he was just picking up on Thomas's anxiety, but Thomas wasn't so sure. He heard his mother calling him to finish getting ready for school. With one last look at Sophie's window, he headed to his room to change. As he pulled on his jacket, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. A pale, tired face that looked older than its 9 years. Dark circles under watchful eyes that couldn't afford to close. Tommy, Emma appeared in his doorway. Mr. Nash offered to watch Sophie sometime if I need help. Isn't that nice of him? Thomas felt his blood run cold. No, he said, more sharply than he intended. Mom, please, don't let him. Thomas. His mother's voice held a warning. We've talked about this. Not everyone is a threat. Not everyone is trying to. She trailed off, unable to voice the fears that had plagued her since becoming a widow. But as Thomas shouldered his backpack and headed downstairs, he couldn't shake the image of Nash standing in their kitchen, his perfect smile never quite reaching his eyes, his gaze always returning to Sophie's window above. He couldn't forget how Cooper, who loved everyone, had stayed pressed against Thomas's legs, silent and watchful. Outside, Nash was getting into his BMW. The car purred to life, a sound Thomas had heard too many times in the dead of night. As they passed each other on the driveway, Nash gave him another smile. See you around, Thomas, he called, and somehow it sounded like a promise. Emma's fingers hovered over the laptop keyboard. The security camera interface opened before her. The installation had cost more than she could really afford, but Thomas's behavior had left her no choice. The small camera, now discreetly mounted in the corner of Sophie's nursery, offered a clear view of the entire room, including the window that seemed to occupy so much of her son's attention. The clock on her desk read 11:42 p.m. Through the video feed, she could see Thomas in his usual spot, sitting against the wall beside Sophie's crib. He was talking softly, though the camera's microphone barely picked up his whispers. "Just need to stay awake a little longer," he murmured, more to himself than to his sleeping sister. "Can't let them get close to you." Emma adjusted the volume, straining to hear more. Them. He kept using that word, but who were they? The therapist had suggested that Thomas was creating imaginary threats to process his grief, giving shape to the formless fear of loss that had haunted him since his father's death. "There's someone out there." Thomas's voice came through clearer now. "I see them watching. Every night they come closer." A chill ran down Emma's spine despite her rational mind's protests. She switched to the exterior camera view, scanning the front yard. Nothing seemed out of place, yet she squinted at the screen. There, by the garden beneath Sophie's window, was that a footprint in her freshly mulched flower bed? Emma zoomed in, her heart beginning to race. The impression was clear. Someone had stood there, recently enough that the morning dew hadn't softened the edges. "It's probably just the gardener," she whispered to herself, but she knew that wasn't true. They hadn't had a gardener since David died. She'd been doing all the yard work herself. Movement on the nursery camera drew her attention back to the interior feed. Thomas had gone to the window, pressing his face close to the glass. His posture was tense, alert, like Cooper when he sensed something wrong. "Mom never checks the garden right," he said softly to Sophie. "They know when to come. They know when she's too tired to look properly." Emma opened her desk drawer, pulling out the small notebook she'd started keeping. Her own observations, meant to track Thomas's behavior for his therapist, now held a different kind of record. 10/21, Sophie's favorite stuffed elephant missing from crib, found in bushes below window. 10/23, muddy smudge on exterior windowsill. No rain in past week. 10/25, motion light battery dead. Was changed last month. Small things, easy to explain away, but seeing them listed together made her stomach twist with unease. On the screen, Thomas had returned to his spot by the crib. Sophie stirred in her sleep, and he reached through the bars to gentle her, humming the lullaby David used to sing. The sound made Emma's eyes burn with tears. A soft thud from outside made her jump. Through the exterior camera, she watched Cooper race across the yard, barking at something, or someone just out of frame. By the time she switched to the other camera angle, whatever had disturbed him was gone. But there was something new in the garden. Emma zoomed in, her hands shaking slightly as the image cleared. There, half buried in the mulch as if dropped in haste, a small silver camera memory card. She looked back at the nursery feed. Thomas was staring directly at the camera now, his expression both vindicated and afraid. He knew she was watching, knew she was finally beginning to see what he'd been trying to tell them all along. "Mrs. Baker?" Thomas's voice came through the speaker, formal and serious in a way no 9-year-old should sound. "I think you should check the garden in the morning. Really check it this time." Emma closed her notebooks, her throat tight. In the morning, she would call the police again. In the morning, she would document everything properly. In the morning, she would finally start taking her son's fears seriously. But for now, she opened another window on her laptop, bringing up the footage from the past week. She had hours of watching ahead of her, searching for whatever Thomas had seen in the dark. Whatever had turned her brave, brilliant boy into a sleepless guardian. Outside, Cooper had settled beneath Sophie's window, his low growl a constant warning in the night. Above him, Thomas maintained his vigil, his small face pale in the camera's infrared glow. And somewhere in the darkness beyond their home, someone watched, waited, and left traces too small for adults to notice, but not too small for a brother's watchful eyes. "Mrs. Baker, we believe Thomas needs more help than we can provide at school." Emma sat rigid in the hard plastic chair, clutching her purse in her lap. Across the desk, Mrs. Peterson, the school counselor, shuffled through a folder of concerning incidents. Behind her, Thomas's homeroom teacher, Mrs. Reynolds, nodded in solemn agreement. His latest art project was troubling. Mrs. Peterson slid a drawing across the desk. Dark crayon strokes depicted a house with ominous shadows lurking outside. A figure stood at a window watching a small bed. He's exhibiting signs of acute anxiety and possible paranoid ideation. Emma stared at the drawing, remembering the memory card she'd found in the garden. She'd turned it over to the police, but they'd said it was probably dropped by a teenager taking nature photos. Just like they'd dismissed the footprints. Just like they'd explained away everything else. "We're recommending Dr. Patricia Carter," Mrs. Peterson continued, pushing a business card forward. "She specializes in childhood trauma and grief counseling. Given what Thomas has been through." Outside the office, Thomas sat in the waiting area, his backpack clutched to his chest. Through the window, Emma could see him watching the parking lot, his eyes tracking every passing car with the hypervigilance that had become his constant state. "He's barely sleeping," Emma admitted. "He's convinced someone is trying to hurt his sister." Mrs. Reynolds leaned forward. "Is this about the new neighbor he mentioned? Mr. Nash?" She exchanged a knowing look with the counselor. "Thomas accused him of taking pictures of your house during recess yesterday. When we investigated, Mr. Nash was simply photographing birds for his nature blog." Emma felt a familiar doubt creep in. Nash had shown her the blog himself, beautiful photographs of local wildlife, accompanied by thoughtful observations. He'd even offered to teach Thomas about photography, trying to connect with the boy who so obviously distrusted him. Dr. Carter's office was designed to be comforting, with soft colors and comfortable furniture, but Thomas sat stiffly on the oversized armchair, his feet barely touching the floor, eyes fixed on the window behind the therapist's desk. "Can you tell me about what you see at night, Thomas?" Dr. Carter's voice was gentle, practiced. "You won't believe me," Thomas said flatly. "No one does. Try me." Thomas was quiet for so long that Dr. Carter thought he might not speak at all. Then, in a rush, "He stands in his yard with a camera. Every night. Sometimes he gets closer to Sophie's window. He has different cameras, small ones, big ones with long lenses. He thinks no one can see him because he wears dark clothes. But I can. I always see him. And he is your new neighbor?" Dr. Carter made a note on her pad. "Mr. Nash. He's not who he says he is." Thomas's hands gripped the armrests. "He changed his license plate. The one he has in the day is different from the one at night. I wrote down both numbers, but when I told the police, they said I must have made a mistake." Dr. Carter's pen moved across the page. "That must be frustrating, feeling like no one believes you." "It's not about believing," Thomas said, his voice rising slightly. "It's about seeing. I see him. Last night he was in our garden again. He left something behind, a memory card. Mom found it, but the police said it wasn't important. Sometimes when we lose someone we love," Dr. Carter began carefully, "we try to protect the people we have left. Sometimes we see dangers that aren't really there because we're scared of losing anyone else. That's a normal response to grief." Thomas's face shut down. He recognized the tone, the same one the police had used, the same one his teachers used. The adult tone that meant they'd already decided he was wrong. "He has pictures of Sophie on his computer," Thomas said quietly. "I saw them through his office window when he left the lights on. Pictures of her in her room, in the yard, at the park." Dr. Carter made another note. "That must be scary for you, thinking about that. It's scarier that no one will look, that no one will check." Thomas turned away from the window to look directly at her. "The monsters aren't in my head, Dr. Carter. They're across the street, taking pictures of my sister, while everyone tells me I'm just sad about my dad." The session ended with Dr. Carter scheduling another appointment and stepping out to speak with Emma. Thomas watched through the office window as they talked, saw the familiar expressions. Sympathy, concern, gentle dismissal of his fears. In the car ride home, Emma tried to sound encouraging. "Dr. Carter thinks she can help you process everything that's happened. She has some great techniques for dealing with anxiety and sleep problems. Thomas said nothing, watching Nash's house as they pulled into their driveway. The black BMW was gone, probably out getting developed whatever photos he'd taken last night. Probably planning his next move while everyone wrote Thomas off as a traumatized child with an overactive imagination. "I'm not making it up," he whispered. But Emma had already left the car, heading inside to check on Sophie and the babysitter. Thomas lingered in the driveway, looking up at his sister's window. The curtains moved slightly. Nash must have been in their house again, using the babysitter's bathroom break or phone call as an opportunity to get closer to Sophie. No one would believe that either. He pulled out his notebook, adding today's entry: "First therapy session. Adults still won't look. Nash getting bolder. Need new plan to protect Sophie." The sound of a car engine made him look up. Nash's BMW turned onto their street, slowing as it passed their house. Through the tinted windows, Thomas caught the glint of a camera lens. Nash waved, his perfect smile in place. A neighbor saying hello to a troubled young boy. But Thomas saw what the adults missed: the predatory gleam in Nash's eyes, the slight smirk when he glanced at Sophie's window, the way his hand tightened on the steering wheel as he drove past. Thomas clutched his notebook tighter. If no one would believe him, he'd have to find proof they couldn't ignore, even if it meant staying awake forever. Because monsters were real. They lived in nice houses and drove expensive cars and took pictures of little girls while everyone else looked away. And sometimes, the only person standing between them and their prey was a sleepless 9-year-old boy who refused to close his eyes. Emma's scream shattered the morning quiet. Thomas bolted down the stairs, his heart pounding, to find his mother standing frozen in the open doorway. On the welcome mat lay Sophie's favorite stuffed rabbit, the one that never left her crib, the one she couldn't sleep without. Its cream-colored fur was slightly damp with morning dew. "It was inside," Emma whispered, her voice shaking. "It was in her crib when I put her to bed." "I know it was." Thomas moved past her to examine the rabbit. Something caught his eye: a small piece of paper tucked into the toy's worn ribbon. His hands trembled as he pulled it free. "Don't," Emma said, but he was already unfolding it. Written in neat, precise handwriting: "She sleeps so peacefully." The security camera footage told a story that made Emma's blood run cold. At 3:17 a.m., a shadowy figure had approached Sophie's window. The night vision showed them standing there for several minutes, just watching. Then, with practiced ease, they had tested the window lock. "The alarm would have gone off," Emma insisted, rewinding the footage again. "We would have heard." "Unless they knew how to disable it," Thomas said quietly. The figure on the screen moved with purpose, familiar with the property's layout. They kept to the blind spots between motion sensors, avoiding the areas that would trigger the security lights. This wasn't their first visit. Emma fast-forwarded through hours of footage. The figure returned at 4:23 a.m., this time carrying something small: Sophie's rabbit. They placed it carefully on the welcome mat, positioned just so: a message, a warning, a demonstration of how close they could get. "We need to call the police," Emma said, reaching for her phone. Thomas watched the footage again, focusing on the way the intruder moved. Their height, their build, the careful precision of their movements. He'd seen that walk before, crossing the street with a plate of banana bread, waving from a black BMW. "They won't believe us," he said. "Not without better proof." But Emma was already dialing, her free hand clutching Sophie's rabbit. Through the baby monitor, they could hear Sophie beginning to stir, demanding her comfort toy with increasing distress. Officer Wilson arrived 20 minutes later, the same officer who'd dismissed their previous calls. He examined the rabbit with professional detachment, his expression already set in lines of patient skepticism. "The camera footage is grainy," he said, watching the screen. "Could be a teenager playing pranks. Or the wind could have blown the toy out through an open window." "The windows were locked," Emma insisted. "They're always locked." "And what about the note?" Officer Wilson studied the paper, frowning. "No obvious fingerprints. Standard printer paper, standard black ink. Nothing we can trace." He looked up at Emma with practiced sympathy. "Mrs. Baker, I understand you're concerned, especially given your situation. Being a single mother isn't easy." Thomas turned away, unable to watch another adult dismiss the evidence in front of them. Through the front window, he saw Nash emerging from his house, right on cue, like he'd been waiting, watching, timing his appearance. Nash waved, all concerned neighbor, and started across the street. Thomas watched him approach, noting how his walk matched the shadowy figure's stride perfectly. "I saw the police car," Nash called as he approached. "Everything okay?" Officer Wilson stepped outside to greet him, and Thomas heard the familiar exchange begin. Nash's practiced concern, his gentle questions about their welfare, his subtle hints about Emma's stress and Thomas's psychological state. Emma went upstairs to comfort Sophie, leaving Thomas alone by the security monitor. He rewound the footage again, freezing on a frame where the intruder turned slightly toward the camera. There, glinting in the infrared light, a ring on their right hand. A distinctive signet ring. Thomas glanced out the window. Nash was gesturing as he spoke to Officer Wilson, his right hand raised to emphasize a point. The same ring caught the morning sun. Upstairs, Sophie had stopped crying. The house settled into an uneasy quiet broken only by the murmur of adult voices outside Nash and Officer Wilson, discussing the overactive imaginations of grieving children, the psychological toll of loss, the way fear could make people see things that weren't there. Thomas added the note to his growing collection of evidence, carefully logging the exact time and date of its discovery. Soon, he knew, Nash would find a way to come inside, to offer comfort and support to the rattled family. He would be perfect, concerned, helpful, and no one would notice how his eyes lingered on Sophie's window, or how his right hand with its distinctive ring kept straying to the camera phone in his pocket. No one except a sleepless boy who had learned that sometimes the loudest warnings came in the softest forms. A displaced toy, a simple note, a shadowy figure who moved like a neighbor in the dark. The adults would look for complicated explanations, for psychological reasons behind their fears. But Thomas knew the truth was simpler and far more dangerous. The monster had just proven he could reach into Sophie's crib while they slept, and he wanted them to know it. Nash had become a constant presence in their lives. He was always there, offering help with a practiced smile that never reached his eyes, bringing groceries when Emma looked tired, collecting their mail when she worked late, suggesting he could watch Sophie to give her a break. "I insist," he said one morning, standing in their kitchen with another batch of fresh muffins. "You look exhausted, Emma. A few hours to yourself would do you good." Thomas watched from the doorway as his mother hesitated. The pieces of Sophie's rabbit incident had been carefully explained away by the adults, rationalized into something less threatening. But Thomas had seen how Nash's eyes lit up when Emma mentioned getting a new security system, how he'd immediately offered recommendations, asking detailed questions about coverage areas and blind spots. "That's so kind of you," Emma replied carefully. "But Sophie's very particular about her caregivers." "Of course." Nash's smile remained fixed, but something flickered in his eyes. "Just trying to be neighborly. In my last community in Oregon, I was practically the neighborhood dad, always helping single mothers with their kids." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. Oregon. The word triggered a memory of something he'd seen while using the library computer during recess. He'd been searching for information about Nash, typing his name into various combinations with Oregon and children. "I should head to work," Nash continued, checking his expensive watch. "But please think about it. I'm just across the street if you need anything." After he left, Thomas approached his mother. "Can I go to the library after school today?" Emma looked surprised. It was the first time he'd asked to go anywhere except home since this all began. Research for a project? Something like that. At the library, Thomas found a quiet corner computer. His hands shook slightly as he typed, "Robert Nash, Oregon, missing children." The first few results were useless. But then he found a small local newspaper article from 2 years ago. A photograph showed a different house, a different street, but the same black BMW parked in the driveway. The same man, though he'd used a different name then. 2 children had disappeared from that neighborhood. girls both under 5. The article mentioned a neighbor who'd helped with the search, who'd consoled the grieving mothers. A neighbor who'd moved away shortly after the second disappearance. Thomas's heart pounded as he read. The police had found nothing. No evidence. No bodies. Just grieving mothers who remembered a helpful neighbor who'd offered to babysit, who'd always been there with food and sympathy. He clicked another link. Another town, another name, another black BMW. Another missing child. Find anything interesting? Thomas jumped. Nash stood behind him, his reflection visible in the darkened computer screen. How long had he been there? Just homework, Thomas managed, trying to close the browser. Looks more like detective work to me. Nash's voice was soft, meant only for Thomas. You know, curiosity can be dangerous, especially for children who don't mind their own business. Thomas felt cold despite the library's warmth. My mom knows I'm here. Of course she does. Just like she knows I'm here. Nash smiled, showing too many teeth. I offered to pick you up when I saw her at the grocery store. She was so grateful for the help. Thomas's blood ran cold. Had his mother really agreed to this? Or was Nash lying? Let's get you home, Nash said, placing a heavy hand on Thomas's shoulder. Wouldn't want your mother to worry, or Sophie to miss her big brother. The drive home was silent. Thomas watched houses pass by, noticing they weren't taking the direct route. Nash drove slowly, almost leisurely, taking back streets Thomas didn't recognize. You should be careful about what you research, Nash said finally. People might get the wrong idea, think you're troubled, paranoid. He glanced at Thomas. Making up stories about innocent neighbors. They pulled into the driveway. Emma wasn't home yet. The house was dark except for the sitter's light in the living room. I know what you are, Thomas said quietly. Nash turned off the engine. In the silence, his smile was no longer friendly. No one will believe you. They never do. He reached over, straightening Thomas's collar with cold fingers. Children have such active imaginations, don't they? Especially after tragedy. Thomas got out of the car on shaking legs. Behind him, Nash called out cheerfully for the benefit of anyone watching. Great chat, sport. Tell your mom thanks again for letting me help. That night, Thomas sat in his usual spot beside Sophie's crib, his notebook open. In it, he'd written everything he'd found. Dates, places, names that Nash had used. A pattern of moved houses, changed identities, and missing children. Sophie slept peacefully, unaware of her brother's desperate scribblings. Unaware of the man across the street who watched her window, who had helped other little girls disappear without a trace. In the darkness, Thomas made a decision. If the adults wouldn't believe his words, he'd have to find proof they couldn't ignore, even if it meant putting himself at risk. Because Nash had made a mistake this time. He'd chosen a victim whose brother understood what others had missed. Sometimes monsters wore expensive watches and brought muffins and offered to help grieving families. And sometimes, the only person who could stop them was a child who knew better than to trust a neighbor's smile. The storm had been building all evening, dark clouds gathering like bruises in the October sky. Thomas sat in his usual spot beside Sophie's crib, watching lightning illuminate the street in stuttering snapshots. Each flash revealed Nash's house across the way, dark and waiting. Thunder rolled overhead, making Sophie whimper in her sleep. Thomas reached through the bars to touch her hand, providing silent comfort. The wind howled and then darkness, complete and sudden. The power outage plunged the neighborhood into black. Thomas heard his mother's muffled curse from her home office, followed by the sound of her searching for flashlights. But he didn't move. His eyes were fixed on Nash's house, waiting for the backup generator he knew would kick in. Didn't. Tommy, Emma's voice carried up the stairs. Stay with Sophie while I check the breakers, as if he'd be anywhere else. Lightning flashed again, and Thomas's heart stopped. For a split second, he saw a figure in Nash's driveway, not heading for shelter from the storm, but moving purposefully toward their house. Thomas fumbled for his phone, fingers trembling as he typed a text to his mother. Someone's outside. The response was immediate. Stay put. calling police. But Thomas knew the police would be too late. They always were. Besides, in this weather, response times would be doubled. He clutched his phone tighter, using its dim light to check Sophie's window. The lock was secure. He checked it compulsively every hour, but in the next lightning flash, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The security system's LED was dark. No power meant no alarm. A scraping sound at the window made him freeze. Metal on metal, someone working at the lock from outside. Thomas's mind raced. The ladder from the garage must have been used. He'd noticed it had been moved slightly yesterday, but hadn't thought. Sophie stirred in her crib, perhaps sensing her brother's fear. Thomas moved silently to the window, phone gripped tight, heart thundering in his chest. Another flash of lightning, and he saw him. Nash, balanced precariously on the ladder, tools in hand, face twisted in concentration. Thomas did the only thing he could think of. He screamed. The sound shattered the storm's rhythm. Nash startled, losing his grip on the wet ladder. There was a crash followed by cursing. Thomas heard his mother's footsteps pounding up the stairs, Cooper barking frantically below. "Thomas!" Emma burst into the room, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "What happened?" "He was at the window." Thomas pointed with a shaking hand. "Nash, he was trying to get in." Emma ran to the window, shining the light down. Below, the ladder lay toppled in the grass. But Nash was gone. Police arrived 15 minutes later, their cruiser's lights painting the rain-slick street in red and blue. They found the ladder, noted the scratches on the window lock, took photos of footprints in the mud. But Nash's house was empty, his BMW gone. "We'll put out an alert," Officer Wilson said, looking considerably less skeptical than he had during their previous calls. "Do you have somewhere else you can stay tonight?" Emma held Sophie close, the toddler mercifully asleep through the chaos. "My sisters. We'll go now." As they packed overnight bags, Thomas noticed something on Sophie's windowsill. A small scratch in the paint, and beside it, words carved so finely they were almost invisible. "Close call, detective." Nash had left his message, knowing Thomas would find it, knowing it would haunt him even as the adults finally began to take the threat seriously. Hours later, in his aunt's guest room, Thomas lay awake listening to the storm. Sophie slept in a portable crib beside him, safe for now. But he knew this wasn't over. Nash had been planning this for too long, had invested too much time grooming their family and learning their routines. He pulled out his notebook, adding today's events to his growing collection of evidence. The police might be looking for Nash now, but Thomas knew they wouldn't find him. Not tonight, anyway. Men like Nash didn't get caught that easily. They retreated, regrouped, and came back smarter and more determined. But something had changed tonight. For the first time, Thomas had proof that others could see. His mother's eyes had been opened. The police had real evidence. And Nash had shown his hand. Thomas touched the window frame of his aunt's guest room, checking the lock for the 10th time that hour. Outside, the storm was passing, but he knew a different kind of storm was just beginning. Nash would be back. Men like him always came back, but this time they would be ready. Detective Laura Reeves stood in Nash's abandoned living room, latex gloves snapping against her wrists as she pulled them on. The house still held the artificial perfection of a staged home. Everything arranged just so, not a possession out of place. Too perfect, like a movie set rather than a lived-in space. "Mrs. Baker," she called over her shoulder. "You're certain he knew about your late-night work schedule?" Emma nodded, holding Sophie closer to her chest. They'd been called back from her sister's house after the police search warrant came through. "He always seemed to know when I'd be working late. Said he kept an eye on the house those nights, for safety." Thomas stood in the doorway, taking in details the adults might miss. The precise angle of the living room furniture, all positioned to provide clear views of their house across the street. The expensive camera equipment partially visible through the office doorway. The wall-mounted television that never seemed to actually play shows, only surveillance footage. "Detective," an officer's voice carried down from upstairs. "You need to see this." They followed Detective Reeves up to Nash's home office. The room's walls were covered in photographs, Dozens of them, all of children. Some were clearly taken with professional equipment, others appeared to be quick snapshots from a distance. And there, in the center of it all, was a collection of recent photos of Sophie. Emma made a choked sound. Some of these were taken through her bedroom window, Thomas said quietly, pointing to a series of images. See how the curtain edge shows? That's why I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the camera flash. Detective Reeves was already calling for the forensics team. Mrs. Baker, we're going to need you to look at something. She hesitated, glancing at Thomas. Perhaps the children should wait downstairs. No. Thomas's voice was firm. I found the evidence. I kept the notes. I deserve to know. The detective studied him for a long moment, then nodded. She led them to a locked door, Nash's bedroom. Inside, they found more than photographs. One wall held newspaper clippings about missing children from different states. Names and dates had been carefully highlighted, connections drawn between cases that had seemed unrelated. Robert Nash isn't his real name, Detective Reeves explained, picking up a stack of driver's licenses from the dresser. Different states, different names, but all with Nash's photo. We're running them now, but it looks like he's been moving up and down the East Coast for years, always following the same pattern. Thomas moved to Nash's desk, drawn to a leather-bound notebook that looked similar to his own. Inside, he found meticulously detailed notes about their family's routines, school schedules, work patterns, even Cooper's walking times. He's been watching us since before he moved in, Thomas realized, flipping through pages. He knew Dad died. He picked us. Detective Reeves took the notebook carefully. This is why we'd like your family's help, Mrs. Baker. We've never gotten this close to catching him before. He's always managed to disappear just in time, leaving us with suspicious circumstances but no concrete proof. But this time he made a mistake, Thomas finished. Because he didn't think anyone would believe me. The detective nodded. Exactly. And now we have enough evidence to prove your previous reports weren't just a child's imagination. We can set up surveillance, coordinate with other jurisdictions. But we need your help. You want to use us as bait, Emma said, her arms tightening around Sophie. With your permission, yes. We believe he'll try again. Men like this, they don't like leaving jobs unfinished, especially when children have spotted them. Thomas felt Nash's final message burning in his mind. Close call, detective. Not a taunt, he realized now. Promise. He's watching the house right now, Thomas said with certainty. Probably from somewhere nearby. He knows you're here. Detective Reeves didn't dismiss him this time. Instead, she pulled out her phone, quickly typing instructions to her team. We'll sweep the neighboring properties. In the meantime, we need to make him think we've hit a dead end. That we've searched and found nothing significant. You want us to go home, Emma said. Pretend everything's normal. With round-the-clock surveillance and a full tactical team hidden nearby, the detective assured her. Every call, every movement will be monitored. But yes, we need you to act natural. Like a family that's been frightened but is trying to move on. Thomas looked at the wall of photographs, at all the children Nash had stalked before Sophie. Some of the newspaper articles had terrible endings. Others just trailed off into uncertain silence. Families left forever wondering what had happened to their children. I'll help, he said firmly. I can make him think I'm too tired to watch anymore. That I've given up. Detective Reeves crouched down to his eye level. You've done an incredible job protecting your sister, Thomas. But from now on, you need to let us handle the watching. Can you do that? Thomas thought of his notebook full of evidence, of all the nights he'd spent fighting sleep while Nash crept closer and closer. He thought of the other children on the wall, the ones who hadn't had someone keeping watch. I'll pretend to sleep, he agreed. But I won't stop paying attention. Not until you catch him. The detective squeezed his shoulder, understanding in her eyes. Deal. Now, let's make a plan to catch this monster. As they left Nash's house, Thomas glanced up at the surrounding buildings. Somewhere out there, Nash was watching, thinking he still held all the cards. Thinking he was still the smartest person in the game. But he'd never faced an opponent like Thomas, a sleepless guardian who documented every move, every pattern, every mistake. And now, finally, Thomas had adults who believed him. The hunter was about to become the hunted. Detective Reeves' plan was simple in theory. Make Nash believe he had another opportunity. Make him think the family had relaxed their guard. But Thomas knew better than anyone that Nash wasn't easily fooled. He'd spent too long watching, learning, waiting for perfect moments. The house felt different with hidden cameras installed in every room, with plainclothes officers patrolling the neighborhood in unmarked cars, with tactical teams concealed in nearby houses. But Thomas knew none of that would matter if they couldn't make Nash believe his opportunity had finally arrived. Remember, Detective Reeves had said during their final briefing, he's likely monitoring all electronic communications. We need to make this look convincing. So Emma made the calls they knew Nash would intercept, arranging to work late, discussing her sister's upcoming business trip that meant no backup childcare, lamenting to friends about how Thomas had finally started sleeping in his own room, like the therapist suggested. Thomas did his part, making a show of dragging his feet when his mother insisted he sleep in his bed. He let his teachers see him finally staying awake in class, nodding approvingly when they commented on his improvement. He even forced himself to walk past Nash's empty house without staring at the windows where he knew cameras still watched. But at night, lying in his own bed for the first time in months, Thomas kept his body still while his mind raced. The police had their thermal imaging and motion sensors, their hidden surveillance and tactical teams. But they didn't know Nash like he did. They hadn't spent months documenting every pattern, every habit, every subtle sign. The power outage wasn't random, he'd told Detective Reeves. He has a way to cut electricity to specific houses. He's done it before. The detective had listened intently, adding his observations to their planning. But Thomas still feared they were underestimating their target. Nash had evaded capture across multiple states, had perfected his methods through terrible practice. A soft tap at his door made him tense. Emma entered, her movements carefully natural for any watching eyes. "Still awake?" she whispered, sitting on the edge of his bed. This part wasn't an act. He could see the fear behind her forced smile. "He knows about the cameras," Thomas said quietly. "He'll have seen them being installed." Emma's hand found his in the darkness. Detective Reeves said that's part of the plan. Make him think we're relying on technology. Make him want to prove he can beat it. Thomas thought about Nash's notebook, about the detailed accounts of their daily routines. He'll wait until he's sure, until everyone thinks the danger's past. The police will be ready. But her voice held a question. "They don't know him like I do," Thomas said. "They don't know how patient he can be." Through the walls, they heard Sophie stirring in her crib. Emma squeezed his hand before standing. "Try to sleep, sweetheart. For real this time." But they both knew he couldn't. Not while Nash was still out there watching and planning. Hours passed. The house settled into its nighttime rhythms, creaking and sighing in familiar ways. Thomas lay still, listening for the unfamiliar sounds that would tell him Nash had begun his move. The digital clock on his bedside table clicked over to 2:17 a.m. when he heard it. A sound so subtle that someone who hadn't spent months listening for it might have missed it. The faint scrape of the ladder being positioned against the house. But not under Sophie's window this time. Thomas reached for the panic button the police had given him, then hesitated. The ladder sounds were coming from the wrong side of the house. Away from all the cameras and sensors they'd so carefully installed. Away from where everyone was watching. Nash hadn't fallen for their trap. He was setting one of his own. Thomas slipped out of bed, moving silently to his door. He could press the button, bring the police running. But Nash would be gone before they arrived, just like every other time. And next time he'd be even more careful, even more prepared. Through his window, Thomas caught a glimpse of movement. A shadow sliding across the yard below, heading not toward Sophie's room, but toward the back door. Toward the one entrance they hadn't fortified because Nash had never shown interest in it before. Thomas looked at the panic button, then at his notebook lying open on the desk. Inside were months of observations, patterns everyone else had missed. Patterns that told him exactly what Nash would do next. He had a choice to make. Follow the plan and alert the police, or trust his instincts one last time. The shadow reached the back door. Thomas made his decision. Sometimes the only way to catch a monster was to think like one. And no one had studied this monster more carefully than he had. The house went dark at exactly 2:24 a.m. Not just their house, the entire block. Thomas watched from his window as lights flickered and died in perfect sequence, just as he'd documented in his notebook weeks ago. Nash had planned this, had probably been practicing the power cuts for months. Thomas could imagine the police scrambling now, their carefully placed cameras and sensors suddenly blind. They'd have backup power, of course, but those precious seconds of darkness would be all Nash needed to make his move. The back door's lock clicked softly. Thomas pressed himself against his bedroom wall, heart thundering in his chest. He could hear the police team's whispered communications through the receiver they'd given him, their voices tense as they realized Nash wasn't where they expected him to be. No visual on the north side. Thermal imaging restarting. Subject not in predicted location. But Thomas knew exactly where Nash was. The careful footsteps coming up the back stairs matched the pattern he'd noted so many times before. Skip the fourth step, it creaks. Long stride over the loose floorboard near the landing. Thomas moved silently to his doorway, Nash's notebook entries flashing through his mind. He'd documented their family's habits obsessively, but he'd missed something crucial. Thomas had been documenting him just as carefully. The hallway security light flickered weakly as its backup power engaged. In that brief flash, Thomas saw Nash's shadow pause at the top of the stairs. Not heading for Sophie's room, not yet. First, he'd check Thomas's room, make sure the boy was really asleep. It's what he'd done in other houses, with other children who might raise the alarm. Thomas touched the panic button in his pocket but didn't press it. Not yet. The police were watching the wrong places, positioned to catch Nash coming through windows or lurking in the garden. Only Thomas knew he'd choose the path everyone thought was safe. Nash's footsteps approached his door. Thomas pressed himself flat against the wall beside it, exactly where the door would swing open and hide him. He held his breath as the handle turned slowly, silently. The door opened. Nash's shadow stretched across the floor, distorted in the dim emergency lighting. He moved toward Thomas's bed, where pillows arranged under blankets created the illusion of a sleeping child. "Smart boy," Nash whispered, realizing the deception. But not smart enough. He turned and found himself face to face with Thomas. For a moment, they stared at each other. Nash's careful mask slipped, showing the predator beneath. But Thomas didn't flinch. He'd seen the monster too many times to fear its face. "They're watching Sophie's room," Thomas said quietly. "Every window, every approach. But you knew that, didn't you? That's why you came this way." Nash's smile was cold, observant, just like the others. But they all made the same mistake, thinking adults would believe them. "I didn't just tell them." Thomas's hand tightened around something in his pocket. "I showed them proof." Nash's eyes narrowed, catching the movement. "The panic button? They're watching the wrong side of the house. I'll be gone before." "Not the panic button." Thomas pulled his hand from his pocket, revealing Nash's own notebook. "This, I took it from your house during the search. The real one, not the fake you left for the police to find." Nash's composure cracked. In the notebook Thomas held were the true details of his crimes. Not just plans and observations, but trophies, pictures, names, evidence he'd kept hidden behind the false wall Thomas had discovered by watching Nash's nighttime routines through his office window. "They won't reach you in time," Nash said, taking a step forward. "And now I'll have to deal with you before." "Cooper," Thomas said quietly. "Now." The golden retriever erupted from the shadows of Thomas's closet, a fury of snarls and bared teeth. Nash stumbled backward, crashing into the hallway table. The vase Emma always kept filled with fresh flowers shattered against the floor. Thomas slammed his hand against the light switch. Not the main lights, which Nash had disabled, but the portable emergency light he'd hidden above the door frame. Brilliant white light flooded the hallway, momentarily blinding Nash. And then everything happened at once. Sophie began crying, the noise triggering the police team's response. Cooper kept Nash pinned against the wall, teeth bared. Emma's door burst open as she ran to Sophie's room. And through it all, Thomas stood calmly in his doorway, watching as Nash's carefully constructed plan collapsed around him. Target spotted. Second floor. Move in. Move in. Subject contained. The house erupted with movement as police teams converged from every direction. Nash tried to bolt, but Cooper's training, those long hours Thomas had spent teaching him to guard on command, paid off. The dog kept him trapped until officers reached the scene. Detective Reeves was the first up the stairs, her face grim as she took in the scene. "Thomas? You okay?" Thomas nodded, watching as officers cuffed Nash. "I knew he'd check my room first. He always does. Makes sure there are no witnesses before taking the target. It's in his notebook. His real notebook." Nash's face contorted with rage as Thomas handed the detective the damning evidence. "You little language," Detective Reeves said coldly, tightening the cuffs. "Robert Nash, or should I say Michael Pierce? Or David Wheeler? Or any of your other aliases? You're under arrest." As they led Nash away, Thomas finally felt the exhaustion of months of vigilance catching up with him. Emma appeared with Sophie in her arms, both shaking but unharmed. "Baby," Emma whispered, pulling Thomas close with her free arm. "Why didn't you tell us about the notebook?" "Had to make him think he was winning," Thomas said, leaning into her embrace. "Had to make him think tonight was his perfect chance." Through the window, they could see Nash being loaded into a police car. His perfect mask had crumbled completely, revealing the rage and madness beneath. But he couldn't hurt anyone now. Couldn't hurt Sophie. Detective Reeves returned, her expression both impressed and concerned. "That was incredibly brave, Thomas. And incredibly dangerous." "No," Thomas said, watching the police car drive away. Dangerous was letting him think no one was watching. Dangerous was not believing children when they say something's wrong. He felt Sophie's small hand grasp his finger, and for the first time in months, the grip didn't feel like a responsibility. Felt like a victory. The monster under the window was gone. The shadows held no more threats. And somewhere in the distance, the power hummed back to life, bringing light to the darkness where a predator had once lurked. 3 months after Nash's arrest, Thomas still found himself waking at 2:17 a.m. But now, instead of taking up his vigil by Sophie's crib, he simply walked to her doorway, checked the new security system's steady green light, and returned to his own bed. The trial had been swift and decisive. Nash's true notebook, combined with evidence found in storage units across 3 states, had revealed the full scope of his crimes. Detective Reeves made sure Thomas didn't have to testify in person. His detailed documentation spoke for him in court. 5 life sentences, Emma had told him after the verdict, her eyes bright with tears of relief. He'll never hurt another child. Other families had come forward, bringing stories of a helpful neighbor who'd vanished when their children disappeared. Some cases were finally solved. Some families finally had answers. And all of them wanted to thank the boy who'd stayed awake long enough to catch a monster. Tonight, Thomas lay in his bed watching the moon cast familiar shadows on his wall. They were just shadows now, no hidden threats, no lurking danger. Cooper dozed peacefully at the foot of his bed, no longer needing to stand guard. A soft knock at his door made him look up. Emma stood there, Sophie balanced on her hip. His sister had grown in the past months, her baby features giving way to those of a toddler. She held her arms out to him, babbling, "Tom-tom," her new favorite word. "She won't sleep," Emma said, but she was smiling. "Keeps asking for her story." This was their new routine. Instead of sleepless vigils, they had bedtime stories. Instead of watching through windows, Thomas watched his sister learn to walk, to climb, to explore a world that was safe for her now. Once upon a time, Thomas began as Sophie snuggled between them. "There was a brave knight who never slept," Emma joined in, adding silly voices that made Sophie giggle. They turned the darkest parts of their story into something else. a tale of bravery and triumph that helped Thomas talk about those terrifying months. After Sophie finally drifted off, Emma carried her back to her room. No longer a nursery, but a toddler's bedroom with bright colors and unobstructed windows. Thomas followed, not because he had to, but because he wanted to kiss his sister goodnight. "Mom?" he asked as they tucked Sophie in. "Do you think Dad would be proud?" Emma gathered him close, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "He always was, baby, and he still is." Through the window, their street was peaceful. New neighbors had moved into Nash's old house. A retired couple who brought over actual cookies, not threats disguised as kindness. Their grandchildren often played in the front yard, their laughter helping to erase darker memories. "Good night, Sophie," Thomas whispered, adjusting her blanket one last time. "Sleep tight." As they left Sophie's room, Thomas paused to check the window lock, not from fear now, but from a brother's love turned into healthy caution. The security system blinked steadily, and outside, Cooper made his nightly rounds of the yard, a happy dog rather than a desperate guardian. Back in his own room, Thomas picked up his notebook, a new one, filled with different kinds of observations. Sophie's first steps, her favorite games, the way she laughed when he made funny faces, a record of joy rather than fear. He was learning to sleep again, to trust in locks and alarms and police who now knew to listen to children's warnings. But more importantly, he was learning that being a protective big brother didn't mean sacrificing his own childhood. As Thomas drifted off to sleep, his room bright with moonlight he no longer feared, he thought about all the other children Nash had stalked. In his testimony, Nash had called them the watchful ones, the children who'd noticed him but hadn't been believed. They were safe now, and their stories would help protect others. The digital clock changed, 2:17 a.m. Once, this time had meant another night of desperate vigilance. Now it was just numbers on a clock, marking moments in a life that held more than fear. Thomas closed his eyes, listening to the normal sounds of his home at night. Sophie's soft breathing through the baby monitor, his mother's footsteps as she finished her evening routine, Cooper's collar jingling as he settled into his bed. No monsters lurked in the shadows now. No predators watched through windows. Just a family healing, a brother sleeping, and a sister growing up safe in a world her brother had helped make better. Thomas slept soundly through the night, and in the morning, dawn's light found him rested, ready for another day of being simply, wonderfully, an ordinary boy with an extraordinary story to tell.